Hello everyone, and welcome to a complete guide on how to play the Hillbilly. For our sake, we'll just call him Billy. In this guide, we'll be going over everything from basic strategy and knowledge to advanced tips and tricks. To start off, Billy is tall and moves at a 4.6 meters base speed with a 32 meter tear radius, so pretty average. First off, we're going to talk about his power. It's called Chainsaw. Pretty simple enough. Billy's Chainsaw ability allows players to traverse the map at a very high speed, break pallets, break breakable walls, or down survivors in one hit if landed properly. If you can't hit survivors with your chainsaw, well, for the rest of your match, you'd probably be better off becoming an M1 killer. It takes 2.5 seconds to fully charge your chainsaw to start your chainsaw sprint, and if you're right on top of a survivor, of course, you're not actually going to sprint with your chainsaw, rather, you'll just automatically down them if hit. Now, a fair warning, just because Billy can down people in one hit does not mean he is an easy killer. He can be pretty damn tough to grasp and even harder to master. Now let's talk about that chainsaw sprint some more. Once you fully rev your chainsaw and line up where you want to run off to, the sensitivity for the first 0.75 seconds is quite high and can be hard to control at first, sitting at 412 degrees per second. However, after that, the sensitivity becomes quite low and it goes down to 32 degrees per second. This can make it really hard to maneuver through obstacles to catch survivors. The drastic change between sensitivity can be very confusing to new players, even to me when I couldn't even hit a survivor to save my life. If you miss too many chainsaw attempts on a survivor or run into obstacles too often, you could overheat your chainsaw. Now, I can hear some of you scratching your head at the thought of that. Overheat? When was that added? Well, that was added in the 4.1.0 patch to rework Billy a little bit. Now, I say rework because it wasn't really a nerf. For most veteran Billy players, even those who play him regularly, they won't suffer from overheating because they'll either end their chases quick enough, know how to manage their chainsaw charges, or not run into obstacles at all. The way the overheat mechanic works is that the rate of the chainsaw overheat is quite high when charging the chainsaw, but during a chainsaw sprint, the overheat rate is significantly lower. For those who like technical terms and specifics, the overheat limit is set at 100 charges by default. Starting adds 5 charges, revving adds 8 charges per second, and sprinting adds 2 charges per second. Heat dissipates at a rate of negative 3.5 charges per second by default. However, if you were to hit the overheat limit, heat dissipates at negative 6.6 charges per second, a lot faster. Add-ons can affect overheat during and before a chainsaw sprint, and if you do manage to overheat your chainsaw by filling the Rev Meter gauge, then it will become white and deactivate your ability to use your chainsaw until the gauge has decreased back to nothing. It is important to keep track of how close the Rev Meter is to capping off so you know when to let off the chainsaw during a chase, to let it cool down. Another important note is that even if you overheat during a chainsaw sprint, you won't be kicked out of your power. Reaching the overheat limit will not interrupt an ongoing chainsaw sprint, and the overheat meter will only decrease when the chainsaw is not in use. In other words, you will continue to sprint until you run into something or let go of M2, or whatever you have on controller. Only then, after the chainsaw sprint, will the meter start to decrease and cool down. Let's talk more about the sprint. The chainsaw noise can be heard within 60 meters, quite far, and must last for at least 2 seconds to be considered a long dash, which is contingent for certain add-ons. When you're ready to down a survivor, get as close to them as possible, just like Wraith when uncloaking. Now, when you get close, start to rev your chainsaw with M2, and make sure that they don't spin you. Many survivors try to run into and around Billies to make them miss. Now, one method that I use to make sure I don't lose any space between me and the survivor is to pay attention to their lower body. They're like spinning tops, so if I look at their lower body, it allows me to track them as well as keep a careful watch on my rev bar. If they're juking me, I will feather my chainsaw and wait for the perfect opening to commit to a chainsaw sprint. As for stopping, it's quite simple to stop sprinting. Just let go of M2 during a sprint to stop and have an animation cooldown after. If you manage to hit your chainsaw onto a survivor, the attack cooldown is 3 seconds. The cooldown for missed chainsaw hits and bumping to objects is also 3 seconds, and there are add-ons to mitigate this and decrease cooldown if you need practice or run into objects frequently. Now, the rev meter is quite useful to keep track of during a chase, and it can help you feather your chainsaw in certain situations. Billy's basic movement speed is 115%, and during a chainsaw sprint, it's 240%, which is around 9.2 meters per second. For those who don't know, feathering a chainsaw is when you keep the rev bar increasing and decreasing over time, whether it's to keep it very close to sprinting to save time when around a corner, avoiding a survivor from spinning you, or trying to mind game at a pallet. Mind gaming with Billy can be very hard to grasp sometimes, and at pallets you can feather your chainsaw to bait a survivor in throwing a pallet early, kind of like Demogorgon with his shred ability. You can also do this to force a survivor in a certain direction, like through a window vault or over a pallet. Feathering is very important to learn with Billy, and once you do learn him, you'll be much stronger as a result. Let's talk about add-ons. In my personal opinion, it's best not to run add-ons at all when learning a new killer. That way you can get used to the base power and practice without any crutches. I usually tend not to run any add-ons at all for multiple reasons. First off, his add-ons aren't really good in the first place. Second is that his add-ons that are actually decent tend to mess with me more. For example, his spiked boots and dad boots add-ons increase the steering during a chainsaw sprint. However, I feel that it hinders the ability to learn overall, because once you adjust and become used to the normal sensitivity during a chainsaw sprint, switching to a faster sensitivity feels more like a hindrance than an assist. Even his iridescent add-ons aren't very good, where the Apex Muffler makes the chainsaw silent for survivors outside of the tear radius, and the iridescent Brook gives the undetectable status after a sprint that is longer than 2 seconds. If you're new and prone to running into objects, then I would suggest using Heavy Clutch, a common add-on that decreases the hard to detect collision zone during a chainsaw sprint. In layman's terms, you won't run into objects as much because your collision zone will be a lot smaller. Other than his add-ons that increase recovery time after hitting objects, the rest are very mediocre at best, so we'll just move on. Let's talk about perks and perk builds. There are a variety of perk builds that can be run on Billy that work very well, but the 2 perks that are probably the best for running in any build is Infectious Fright and Barbecue and Chili. Infectious causes any survivors near tear radius to scream and reveal their location when downing a survivor, or with a basic or special attack. It is very strong and good for information. Barbecue is also really good to find survivors after hooking someone, allowing Billy to quickly traverse the map and start another chase. Barbecue is also one of the best perks in the game and is highly recommended. Another good build for Billy is Spirit Fury and Enduring, which are very good perks to use on Billy, but for me, I don't use them too often. Lethal Pursuer is a new perk and teachable for the Nemesis. Seems to be very strong early game for Billy, where you can see the auras of all survivors for 9 seconds at the beginning of the trial. Vaulting against a Billy is a strong counter for survivors, kind of like breaking line of sight with Nurse. So to mitigate that and avoid survivors taking vaults to avoid your chainsaw, Bamboozle might be in order for a build to block out windows. Another good perk is Corrupt Intervention, one of Plague's teachables. This blocks off 3 gens at the beginning of the trial, highlights them in a white aura, and allows you to have a little bit more time to find survivors as well as some information on the map. Let's move on to maps. Indoor maps are really awful for Billy, as your ability to traverse the map via chainsaw sprint is cut down tremendously. This is where mind gaming is very necessary on weaker maps, and we'll get into that later. The best maps for Billy are ones that are very open, where you can see as much as possible. However, on small maps, you can use the limited space to your advantage and corner a survivor quicker. My favorite maps for Billy are Ormond, Red Forest, and Macmillan, just because they are very, very open. Not many people like Ormond, and I understand why, but it is an all-time favorite of mine. Now, setting up each game. Every game, the best first move is to start a chainsaw sprint and run to the furthest gens on the map. Survivors spawn on the opposite side of the map from the killer, so in this instance, Corrupt is really good as it blocks the furthest gens and tracks them for you in a white aura. Survivors could be immersed the first couple minutes, so don't get discouraged if a gen or 2 pops before getting any real progress in the match. Billy is one of the few killers that has the power to end a game really fast or come back from a strong deficit. Hurting survivors into specific areas can also be hard. Again, mind games will come into play here. Next, let's talk about the small chance of sniping or long-shotting someone. Act as though Billy's sprint is a car. It might be silly to think, but imagine it. As shown in the gameplay on screen, I extend my chainsaw sprints to cover the entire map by moving my cursor back and forth around corners. Let's say I'm on the left side of Macmillan's groaning storehouse, and I want to curve around it to find a survivor. You know when cars swing very wide to make a U-turn in the opposite direction? That can be done on Billy to curve around loops and buildings that most people wouldn't think to do. It can help the game get off to a really good start if timed correctly. You can make one chainsaw sprint last for a very long time and even cause you to overheat if done properly. It will not only give you info on where the survivors are, but what gens are being worked on. After having more practice with Billy, you'll be able to thread the needle through really slim openings on maps, and that will just take practice to learn. Now let's talk about looping. Billy is really weak when it comes to dealing with TNL walls. He essentially becomes an M1 killer if you're having trouble mind gaming them to get a chainsaw play. Act as though you're playing Huntress or Demo. You need the survivors to get into an animation lock so that you can chainsaw as they go through a window vault. It takes time to learn how to mind game in certain windows, and don't be discouraged from experimenting as well as messing around to get your footing in Billy. Downing survivors becomes easier when at unsafe pallets and bad loops, and we'll get into that later. If you're able to hook survivors in the basement, it is essentially a free hook once someone goes down to rescue. Every time you head down the basement stairs chasing a survivor, you have to start revving your chainsaw before you turn the corner. That way, once you turn the corner, you can down the survivor who's rescuing, and if you're cheeky enough, you can down the recently unhooked survivor. If a survivor is straight up farming their teammates by saving in front of you, then there is no issue putting them right back down on the ground. Let's talk about coming back from a bad game. Every killer has bad games, whether it's just a warm-up or an off game in general. When survivors start throwing themselves at hook and being way too altruistic, it's easy to punish them for it, causing them to snowball quickly and throw the game. Remember, a cocky survivor is a bad one. Billy has immense power to come back from an initially bad game, and when survivors get cocky, they make mistakes. There's no shame in slugging either. If you see several people around a hook, use that to your advantage. Down them and move on to the next survivor. When you can one down players as Billy, it's easy to punish survivors who are cocky as hell. Take your time, and a comeback is possible no matter what. Another important note is that when you start to rev and prepare to down a survivor who's currently in the animation of saving a teammate, take your time with it, because if they save quickly enough, the unhooked survivor can possibly get in the way and body block for a borrowed time play. Get out of their way and down your initial target. If the unhooked survivor chooses to body block you, even with borrowed time and D-strike stopping you in your tracks, there is no shame in tunneling them down and sending them straight to the defeat screen. If they want your attention, then give it to them, especially if you're not trying to tunnel in the first place. With practice, you can get survivors down on loops like this and Killer Shack by holding your chainsaw straight and then turning at a 90-degree angle when going around a corner, instantly downing them. This can be at a regular loop or like Killer Shack shown on screen after they vault through the window after a little mind game. Another important note is that survivors will probably try to hop into a locker to avoid your chainsaw, so in that case, stop revving, let it go down, cool down, and then take them out of the locker manually. Hey y'all, hope you're enjoying the video so far. Before I get to the last part and do a little live commentary about advanced tips and whatnot, I'd like to say shout out to Bronx, another DBD creator who made the complete guide to the Demogorgon, which was a big inspiration for this video. He's all around a very good creator, so I would very much suggest go sub and follow to him on Twitch. All around great guy. I'll leave links in the description. And let me know what you guys think of this video. I put a lot of fucking effort into it, and I hope it turned out well. And without further ado, I'll get into the last section, and enjoy, guys. Peace. Alright, so I wanted to end this video kind of live commentating over a little loop that I thought would be good on Macmillan. So if you're chasing a survivor this way, probably should start your chainsaw right here, so that if they drop the pallet, they can instantly break it. But if they don't, then you can possibly get a chainsaw sprint right here, or you could just let go and get a nice M1. Now, if you're running around this little section, probably good to just keep revving and feather all the way until you can get a chainsaw. It's hard to feather through objects when you're new, and it will just take time and practice. A lot of people also like to change their keybinds to Q and E instead of having it as their, regular mouse, and I think that is a worse way to do it. I don't think that's too good overall, and I would just stick to being the mouse and using the sensitivity there. If you're running a loop like this, you also want to kind of just make sure they drop the pallet as soon as possible. That way you're not wasting so much time on a loop. And overall, my paid actors are very good. Yep, point at the camera. They're very good paid actors. And I hope this guide was very good, to say the least. I appreciate you guys watching.